Okay, hi everyone. Welcome back to Ethics TV. I'm Jonathan, and I'm joined today by David Van Bruwaene. You can see his details in the description. And so, David, thanks for joining. What is keeping you busy at the moment?
I am working on keeping people safe from artificial intelligence, is one way of putting it. Keeping people in a position of control over how their information is used when it's in a system that's automating information feeds to them, or more importantly, in many cases where it's making decisions about their lives on behalf
Mm.
of them. That can involve things like whether they get a loan, whether they are passed over for a job, and especially in the case of hiring, whether the eyeballs are on their resumes, for example. So we have a large number of applications where there's intelligent processing of your data that goes on behind the scenes, and there's a growing group of people that are not just concerned, but are implementing solutions for testing, for evaluating, and ultimately for standardizing the way that we assess the safety of platforms that are using artificial intelligence. So this is my main gig, and then on the side, I have a wonderful family that's a big part of what keeps me up at night.
Yeah, no kidding. Oh, so where to start? Now, viewers of Ethics TV, I mean, we're young, right? We've only been here for like a month or two, and but anyone who's watched any other episode will know my view on what you've just said. So, but for those of people who are just watching the first episode, being this one, um, I obviously have a an extraordinary resonance with what you've said, at an existential level without overplaying it. So I think the part of the rabbit hole I'd like to touch on for people who are newcomers to this topic even, is why do you feel that's important?
So there's no reason to think it's not important if you understand what's going on. Anyone who understands what's going on will see immediately that this is one of the most important issues of our time. I mean, there's lots of um, interest in how other humans treat any of us. Obviously, we would like at our jobs not to be passed over. We would like to have um, information handed to us that was you know in our own best interests. Um, when human editors, for example, say this is what's most important news for you to look at in a old standard newspaper, we say I don't like that editorial content, so I'm going to buy a different newspaper and get that kind of information fed to me. When it's an algorithm that's sorting out what information you get in your feed, it's the same kind of thing. It matters what decisions the algorithm's making, why it's making those decisions, and on behalf of whose interests. Um, when we're looking at things like uh, advice given to you by a chat assistant, we care if that chat assistant is um, treating you with respect, is giving you information that represents the world fairly, and giving the most pertinent information that's going to help you with your life. If it's a mental health chat bot, for example, and it's recommending that you do things that are harmful, we got a problem with that. If in the same way that we would if a human did it. So these are just a few of the applications of artificial intelligence that are affecting people's lives all the time, and they're acting in a very kind of personal way. So the information processing that has impacted our lives prior to the advent of modern artificial intelligence. You could think of it as being a little more sterile, as just being kind of helpful tools. But at this stage, it's operating on very rich human text data, image data, things that impact the social aspects of our lives, things that impact what we have deep concerns about human meaning and human value, and then making decisions, making curatorial choices, and phrasing things now, like literally phrasing things in ways that have a great, human impact. So a big part of it is the data that's being used to train these algorithms, and the data that these algorithms are given access to in order to operate. And so a lot of the problems that humans have already been, very much responsible for gets recorded in data, and then the algorithms are trained on that data, and then they perpetuate that same behavior. So if you have institutional discrimination, that then becomes part of the data fingerprint of that organization. And the patterns are very quickly learned by the statistical algorithms. And if you don't do anything to correct them, then they will just be repeated. And there's a lot of very prominent examples that I think get to the point of it. So if you have a gap in a resume that may be around maternity leave, this can be then very quickly recognized as a pattern, and people are less likely to be offered jobs after a maternity gap. So a hiring algorithm will see that gap and then do the same thing, say this, you're not likely to hire this person, right? If women are passed over for jobs, you scan the resume and it says women's volleyball team, even if you haven't explicitly recorded gender, you still are going to have that bias that's picked up, and the algorithm will repeat the behavior that has been a part of the institution's past. So we have a very large opportunity to correct. By automating human behavior, we can correct human behavior. So there's a lot of positive opportunities that we have at this stage. But also, if we do nothing, we're quite assured that we're going to see a repeat of failures that we past.
Yeah. Do you feel that there is a difference in how the humane, empathetic view of that risk is, with on the other side, a corporate, dominion-based, greed-controlled objective, which is at any expense? And if there is a difference or a dissonance between two objectives, do you feel that there is how can we address that difference or dissonance between those two wolves at the door?
So the corporate interest, profit maximization, can be aligned in many areas with human values. If you maximize your profits by improving people's lives and then being compensated for that, for example. And where consumers are more careful in the products that they use, then this can have a very big impact. A lot of safety, like AI safety testing, or digital safety in general is actually at a corporate level being championed by teams like marketing teams or teams concerned with brand, for that very reason, that consumers do care and will make choices with their pocketbooks. But that said, if you are optimizing an algorithm and you're a company, you're paying money in order to maximize profits, and that will be in order to get as many eyeballs on content with advertisements or on the most salacious content. And I mean, this is hard to work against.
I agree. I mean, I'm building a Self, which is essentially a tool to make your life easier. And my view of this, and it includes a large artificial intelligence component. My view on this is that the way that we have to build is in a way that people's information and data is entirely sovereign to them individually, not even to the company itself. And that sovereignty has to then be guarded with such a significant level of anonymity when anything of that guarded data is exposed to the web, that there is no fingerprint of the individual left elsewhere other than inside their own system. And I have an ambition for that to mature into what I call entirety as an operating system, where that builds new technologies and OSs that are also sovereign. But that ideology is something that is, apart from being immensely complicated and expensive, I found that there are still people who would feel that that isn't needed due to the fact that the existing tools are okay. We know that Facebook's scraping our data and training its LLMs, but at least I can see pictures of cute cats. Or we know that this particular company is reading and listening to everything we say. And we even know that when we turn our phone off, the microphone is still on, but that's okay because I'm not a criminal, therefore I've nothing to hide. I met someone last month who said that the reason that he likes TikTok is because, and these are his words, not mine, that he knows that the Chinese government are listening, and their ambition is to make sure the content he sees on TikTok is most relevant to him. So I know the feeling of not only trying to stand in the wave of what people are used to, and the corporate ambition of kind of doing whatever the hell that they want, because everyone's signed up to the terms and conditions, and we're legally, there's not that many restrictions in place. It's actually more problematic to buy a large company if you're a large company and get investigated by the Monopolies and Mergers Commission. That's a problem to these guys. What doesn't seem to be such a problem is whether or not human rights are being upheld, because their answer is, well, human rights are not universal laws, they're guidelines. Whereas my view is that human rights is a natural, should be a natural law, but I would, without being too hyperbolic, I'd extend that to say that the law of robotics, whether it's the primary three or even the fourth or zeroth law, as it's known, should be a mandate, a global mandate, and enforced with extraordinary penalties. So I can see it from all the way around the clock face. I was wondering, from your perspective, and this may be, well, a plug for Fairly AI, but what are the ways in which this can be addressed?
And so consumers want convenience, they want the lowest price, and typically don't care at the end of the day even about their own data privacy and the issues around fairness and bias and so on come out at a statistical level typically, and that you don't ever know that you were that race, age, gender was part of a decision. It was just more likely, and people don't do well with probabilities. So I get all of that. That said, people always would prefer to have a solution that was treating their data properly. They just won't pay for it. So they will vote, for example, for governments that do some amount of regulation. I I tend to think regulation is a a, a stopgap, a final. If nothing else works, then usually poorly enforced and heavy-handed regulation comes in and stops the worst of things. Like GDPR came in with data and did perhaps some good. But my ambition is always for there to be entrepreneurial, or I mean, look at how you could improve the world, make a more well-functioning service or system that was ethical. Because very often, when you do it right, you actually add more value on, say, a feature level. Or so data sovereignty. I've thought a lot about that. I have a few ideas about how this can be done well. Data sovereignty can help with things like siloed data. So in terms of a person having control and ownership of their own data, rather than it being siloed in many different clouds and private corporate locations, what would be possible would be to do things. If we took it really seriously that I should own my data and the services should operate on my data in a way that I have control over, I could then share that data across many different services much more fluidly, so that things like my Netflix recommendation algorithm, I could train the same data on my Amazon. I mean, I could have a lot more control over the intelligent systems operating on my data, and I could even share information. If I own my data, I'd be okay to give my calendar to a bunch of different services, and they could do a lot more, especially on an agent-based system. This would be a much more powerful way forward. So I could have like AI assistants that could actually be effective, because I could give them full access to all of my data spread across all the different things that I'm operating on, if we had a model in which data ownership was central, rather than having to somehow access into all these different private repositories that have tried to scrape my data in order to convince me to buy things, basically.
Yeah, I agree. That's exactly what I agree with, and happily, it's exactly what I'm building. So I feel that you've just walked yourself onto the advisory board, which is useful, but not the point of this call nonetheless. But I love the fact that you seem to be, you and I are aligned from the Fairly perspective. How do you approach the world with an offering, bearing in mind that there is a level of education here that's required, to sometimes to even illuminate the whole point? It's like going to a school, to a soccer field with a new game, and the game is a circle as opposed to a rectangle or a square, and there's no hoops, there's no nets, there's a different gadget, and you want to actually sell the benefit of the game, but because the game is fundamentally adjacent to what people are used to. One has to kind of um, uh, create the awareness of why the game matters first, and then talk about the architecture of the game. Whereas if you went with a different football team to a football field, it's like, your football team's on the football field. This is a different football team. And people go, I get it. It's like if someone goes to an investor and says, we want to raise $10 million for our social media app. It allows people to share content with each other. People go, oh, right, cool. So it's like the next TikTok. And you're like, yeah, that's right. Whereas, and I found this when I was raising for the first round for Self, I spoke to some of the let's call ethical VCs, and the conversations were great up until the final question where they said, "So how do you monetize?" And what they wanted me to say was, well, we're going to take everyone's data and we're going to carve it all up and sell it to the highest bidder or sell it to advertisers. And I said, that's fundamentally not what we're going to do over my dead body. And then the call disconnects. So it's a weird one, isn't it? Even when you find the most ethical people in the world don't actually understand that surely one of the primary principles of being ethical is to not acting in an unethical way. So how do you go to the market and describe the reason for all of this and then the service? How do you position that?
So with Fairly AI, we are doing testing and assurance on AI products
Huh.
in order for companies to be able to pass certification standards, be regulatory compliant, as well as to have smaller companies be able to sell to larger enterprise. So to give a layer of comfort, right? So that's a value proposition that people understand. It's similar to a security testing value proposition. But you would be surprised that, or maybe you wouldn't be, a lot of people would be surprised that, companies want to do the minimum that they possibly can get away with. And there's a lot of checking of boxes rather than actually ensuring that the technology is properly functioning. But when I reposition as, do you care about churn with your, I mean, if your customers are getting a terrible product, who cares whether it's been certified or it's been stamped as being fair and ethical? The consumer will see it. If you have, especially now that the technology is moving towards things like chat interfaces, in the generative setting where you see the actual content produced by an AI system, the consumer will now see that this is treating them with respect or not, giving them information that's valuable or not. And if you are in a marginalized group and it's not treating you with respect, then finding an offering where it does treat you well, it becomes more like a positive. So in consumer lending, for example, you can talk about bias and all the horrible things, or you can talk about financial inclusion. Financial inclusion to a bank means that you can issue more loans and make more money. It also boosts your brand. It also gives people opportunities. So it's just a positive way of putting it.
And what are the frameworks that a company needs to have, or the hoops that a company needs to go through to be to receive the commendation of being up to standard? Are
Mhm.
they things that they need to do in terms of prompt engineering, or are they, well, two different questions. One is, what would a company need to do? And the second is, what do you do to ensure that that company does that?
So it depends on if you're using, say, a generative model, um, or whether you're using one that's making a decision or a predictive model.
Mm,
Um, and then the industry that you're operating in will have uh, different standards, different regulatory requirements, of course. But um, there's ISO standards that are becoming the de facto for artificial intelligence. So ISO 42001 uh, is a broader standard that is your whole business process is covered, your data handling to how it's monitored for security, uh, to corporate governance. So very broad, and then more specific things can be tested along the way, depending upon where you're operating. There's also in the States, NIST is very popular. It's AI risk management framework that's is a pretty comprehensive one. And then you can get into more focused testing and certification around that. And then for regulated industries like banking, there's fair lending laws. So
mm,
we do work with banks to help them test for discrimination in their algorithms and test their suppliers. So a lot of banks will back a fintech, for example, and there's regulatory exams that come in, and you have to prove that you've tested it and that you have ongoing monitoring processes. And then similarly in healthcare. Um, so that's where the bread and butter of the business is. But in the emerging world of Gen AI startups, mostly that are finding creative uses for it, we're finding a lot of interest in having the same certifications. Um,
mm.
because it's very hard to get your product to be accepted by an enterprise if it's one of the newer Gen AI technologies. And so the fact that you have started the work towards certification often gets you past the early stages of procurement, but then there's a lot more questions asked about specific testing. So for fairness, for example, if you're giving a loan or not, we can break people into different social groups, and then we can compare the outcomes. We can compare the error rates, and there's some very relatively simple statistical measures that can be done. It's pretty straightforward at this point. Whereas with generative AI, there's thousands, tens of thousands of categories of things that could be tested against. And then each of those can be tested in a million different ways. So we create scenarios, we run adversarial tests, we do happy thread tests, and then we see whether it will give you the recipe for a bomb, um,
Yeah.
whether it won't give you the recipe for the bomb unless you ask it with a particular dialect. Now it will. I mean, there's so much that can be tested against. And so having that as a routine part of your monitoring and your development of these systems is becoming de facto now in the same way that you do security testing in a routine way.
Is there a regulation, or sorry, a guideline of any kind, or a measure in terms of the level of user control or data sovereignty that a system could be tested to see what the rights? I'm trying to retrospectively now place the first of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the United Nations of our rights to freedom. And I'm going to use here the freedom of choice in its infinite context of freedom, um, of choice of where our data goes. Is there a regulation that speaks to that?
So a choice to
where our data goes. So let's say we say something into an LLM that we say that my mother's name is Rose. I want a poem about her and her love of cooking.
Mhm.
Um, where that information goes, we know in an LLM is it trains the system on a number of things. And if you are using a platform that also has a volume of your personal information attached to it, it is also saying that not only is this person's mother's name is Rose and she loves cooking and this person wants a poem written, but this poem lives at this address and has this social
Mhm.
security number
Right.
and looks at these adverts and has got these friends and
Yeah.
and his or her phone book there are these contacts. So is there a regulation that speaks to the level of control that a user has as to where their information goes and how it's used?
So if we're looking at GDPR, uh, general data protection regulations in Europe that applies basically across the world because you could have a European use your service wherever you are. There is the right to have your personal data destroyed, as well as the right to be given that data, subject access request.
And
So
what about
that
the right for it to not actually be used unless I say so?
so that's part of the terms of service that you agree to.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is where I wonder whether the from a human rights perspective, where there's quite an interesting blind spot potentially from in the world of regulators. Um, it is the common thought is one has signed the terms and conditions, which in Facebook's case is the size of the Magna Carta. Someone has signed the terms, which of course no one reads, signed the terms and conditions. Therefore, your
Mhm.
data is sure being used to curate an entire social graph and blah blah blah. But it's okay. We're compliant because you can request your data at any time and whatever. But if we just rewind the tape slightly and press pause and slow-mo,
Mhm.
I'm wondering whether or not if people knew what was in the terms of service, people would sign them. And I'm wondering whether the level of prosaic text inside terms and service is so that people don't read them. And I'm wondering whether or not an opportunity to be more fair and ethical in technology is to create a term of service with one line that says the information is yours. If you tell us we can use parts of it to do stuff, then let us know. But we'll be completely transparent about that in advance. Up until then, you're the only owner of you. But that goes against every principle that's not only taught in business school about how to build good business, it runs across every single large technology firm and most small technology firms, especially if you're a small technology firm and you want to raise money from an investor, who it also runs across as standard good business practice. They sign the terms of service, we're golden. Is there something
Yeah.
in that?
So if you sign a lease and there's something in that lease that says that you're not allowed to have pets, but your local municipality says everyone's allowed a pet, if that's how you have, in that case, then you sign the lease, but that clause gets stricken, right? I mean,
Mm,
it's not legally enforceable, even though you signed it. It's the
mm,
same way for very large terms of service. Um,
mm,
there's got to be more regulation around misuses of data
mm,
that operate in that same way. I
mm.
I fully agree, and there are. It's just very convoluted and it's not very well enforced. And then, um, how is it interpreted in the courts?
Yeah,
So
and
if you
it's
look at like
interesting. Carry on.
training
Yeah.
training a model, right? So that's an interesting case. If
Mm,
your data is used to train the model, you could remove the data that the model was trained on, but the model still will retain some information that was caused by your data. And
mm,
then in the case of New York Times and other lawsuits against OpenAI, the courts are still figuring out how to interpret this. If the
Mm.
model can be queried and it produces an exact replica of the input data, that seems like a clear case that the data wasn't destroyed. On the other hand, can you prove that it was exactly caused by that data? There's a lot that's still being sorted out right now.
Mm.
And I think, I mean, in general, a company can't operate without some protections. They do have to process your data. And unless we all give up our phones and go back to the woods, we're going to have to deal with some requirements for a business to be able to do this.
Yeah, and
But
I'm wondering whether how much in control of that the human individual is. It's a good example that you mentioned about lease and municipality. Um, and this is a complete ideology, so I'll apologize in advance to anyone watching who feels that this is kind of the bit tree hugger, tofu eating part of my personality. But um, if the lease is the terms and service from a large technology firm, I believe that the municipality's overarching um, allowance is human rights,
mhm,
my view. And I
mhm,
believe that human rights trumps individual terms of service. I believe that.
mhm,
And from let's take it from a United States of America perspective, one could believe that the Constitution is something that should be upheld regardless of something else. So if a coffee company, when you're standing in a coffee company and you're saying something that you believe in out loud, not at the top of your voice, you're not being aggressive or overly annoying, you're just saying something that is your view.
mhm.
The Constitution would say that you have freedom of speech.
Mhm.
And if the coffee company says you don't have freedom of speech, tough biscuits. You've got
Yeah,
freedom of speech. If you have a gun license, you have a right to bear arms to defend your property and your family and so forth. But if someone else comes into your property and they say, "I hate guns, I'm gonna, you can't live on this neighborhood with a gun," the Constitution says that you can, and
yeah.
you have a license accordingly. What's your view from a human rights perspective of how our human rights could or perhaps even should be applied to these guidelines?
So I'm fundamentally in agreement with you that human rights trump everything. I mean, in the case of how a government or company operates, then there are specific interpretations that they'll go through. Um, if we're talking about human rights around data processing, automated decisioning, then we don't have such a long history of philosophy or the dialogue around this is quite new. And so drawing on principles that have been developed before the advent of modern computing, we look at principles like privacy or um, rights to autonomy to being informed about how decisions are being made about ourselves that become very opaque in these environments. If I am denied a loan, that happened before we used algorithms to crunch your social data to say that you had a social profile that probably doesn't pay back the loan, right? But we still could talk about more fundamental human rights of being, given fair treatment, being given a rationale, and being able to inspect that rationale, for example. So I think that um, there is a whole lot of work to be done to connect more fundamental principles, and there may be new principles that we have to work out um, that do apply in a more sui generis way to the digital world. Because I mean, if we think about what's your right to ownership of your own data? That is that just a core human right to property? I mean, maybe
Or
it is
is
just.
is it if we're living in a digital physical world, one could argue that the rights to your own data is the same as your rights to your own identity. And if it's
Mhm.
the right to your own identity, that is as sacrosanct as your birth certificate and your social security number. It's who you are. It's um, if we looked at it in a parallel like that, one could say that this is not the situation we're in at the moment is not dissimilar to us handing over our entire personal identity to a system that makes billions and some towards trillion-dollar valuations of companies who couldn't care less about the consequences from an ethical and moral perspective because shareholder value go up. And I I think I've become more realistic as I'm going to, and I'm now in my early 50s. I spent my 40s, I spent my 30s being angry about it. I spent my 40s being gradually realistic about building alternatives anyway, regardless. And now in my 50s, thinking, I think it's unlikely that regulations and legislations will change to the benefit of humans in general, in terms of the human rights and the application of those things, because the organizations that make the laws and regulations are largely funded by the organizations that are, in my view, fundamentally abusing those human rights. So, A, you can build alternatives. B, you can do what you're doing, the good work of and keeping up the good fight. But C, I think it may come to pass over time that there will be a moment when that humans either rapidly, and I mean rapidly, like people's awareness of the importance of, let's say, airport security after there's a disaster, um,
Mhm.
rapidly realize the risks of what we're talking about in these new technologies, the fact that the human race has essentially given birth to a new species. So they rapidly become aware within a 24-hour period, or it's a generational thing, and we have to grandfather in these conversations, which is one of the reasons for ethics TV, so that in one generation's time, my children, your children, they're kind of 1% further along the dial of realizing the importance of these things. And then 6 generations' time, it's normal. It's like,
Yeah.
well, of course, your digital rights are the same as your physical right. Your body as a person and the rights to your body is the same as the rights to your digital identity. Of course, hey,
Yeah.
can you believe in 2024 this was even a conversation? So I'm wondering whether it's either a radical shift or whether it's a generational shift over multiple generations.
I think that there's going to be some cliffs for sure, or steps in the change. Um, w- we used to talk about the extended self in philosophy when I was in school back not too long ago. It, when I was in my in the like in the late 90s, early 00s, there was still a lot of talk about personal identity, thought experiments, where we would talk about Star Trek. If it beamed you twice onto the planet, then which one is you? You know, that kind of fun thought experiment.
Yeah.
Uh, and then we had uh, a few, kind of out there philosophers talking about, maybe your spinal, because you could do a brain implant, right? And they were like, maybe you should also include the spinal cord, right? Obviously not your fingers, right? That's not part of you, right? That 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 kind of conversation has now progressed to extended self, where a lot of people think your phone is in some sense a part of you, or at least you've outsourced a lot of your brain into your notes app, and your memory is now living in this broader place. That kind of conversation, I think, is a gradual one, and one where maybe people will all just assume that our digital, especially if the metaverse happens or whatever, it'll just be kind of obvious. And then if someone were to own part of you, that would be a problem. And we will all wake up one day, and I mean, this does happen. All of a sudden, it's like the whole world just wakes up together and sees that something is off, you know.
Mm.
Um,
I mean, yeah, one of the reasons why I'm building something called Self is for all of the philosophical points you've mentioned. Yeah, I fantasize about the global awakening, or what I would call the philosophical revolution or the ethical revolution of a kind of an awareness. I liken it in a really bad analogistic way to when everyone realized that MySpace sucked. And and but then uh, but then we wholesale bought into a version that was like a draconian version of MySpace. So it's like, yeah, it's like out with the old boss, in with the new boss. You know, it's people who believe that a partisan government is somehow going to be better for them because, you know, the party with that color were enemies to us, but the party with that color really care about our human rights. It's like, I absolutely assure you that that's not the way politics works. So, but it's interesting because when I'm in my more reflective moments each day, normally at yoga, I have to check in with myself as to whether or not, even if this is a fruitless exercise, to try and build alternatives and like with Ethics TV, have conversations with people about ethical, purpose-driven innovations. If that's pointless, is it still worth it? And then I look at what pointless mean no effect. And then I think about the fact that you can change the whole world by changing one person's life. If you change one person's life, their whole world has changed.
mhm.
So changing the world isn't changing 8 billion people or changing an entire tech landscape. Changing the world is creating something that benefits one person once. And so I would posit that fairly AI changes the world profoundly, even if one thing that you've put in place is adhered to and it benefits humanity once. That's already the win. That's and I kind of almost have to believe that what I do with my teams around the world has that same metric. I mean, it doesn't play well in optics for venture capital investors, because they say, well, no, how many users have you got? And I'm like, no, it's not about the volume of users. It's about the fact that we're changing only one person's life once. So they're like, well, come back when you've changed 10 million people's lives once. And yeah, how do you, just in
So
closing, how do you
yeah.
reason with, how do you sit with that?
So if you invent a paddle and that gets your canoe down the river in one continent, guess what? Someone on another continent didn't talk to you. You didn't do anything to influence it, but they came up with the same idea. If if you vote for one political party, your vote means nothing. It's just one vote, you think, but
Mm.
everyone else is thinking the same way that you do. If this is not a causal thing, but I mean, the fact that you actually get up and do something probably means that someone else is getting up and doing something somewhere else.
I
Just
hope
the
so.
fact of it. And it's not that the fact that you do it's not doing it doesn't cause them to, but you know, I I joined a incubator early on, and everyone seem to have the same ideas about I should have a personal finance app that helps people better manage their money. I was like, let's save the world from this impending artificial intelligence issue. And I was like, I don't know what you're talking about, but that's kind of cool. But you could see the groupthink, and everyone else had kind of, I mean, they had groupthink in a way, but they had independently all come. And then if you are an investor, you see that all the time, that there's just a new flock of all these people that independently are on the cusp of a wave, effectively. So there is a new wave happening of people that are trying to reclaim ownership over our data, reclaim control over how it's used, and who actually care. And we may be in the vanguard, but the fact that you're doing this, I'm doing this, I keep running into people everywhere who are deeply concerned, suggests that we're all on that path. And so pick up the mantle, go do it, it's it's
That's
happening.
that's a perfect way of ending this talk. And it's I wonder from a psychotherapy point of view whether or not the reason I'm doing ethics TV is to continually be reminded that I'm not alone. So thank you for reminding me of the fact that you're absolutely right. There's a it is true. I'm having more and more and more and more and more conversations that are leaning more and more and more towards the same type of topics. And when I wrote my first book 25 years ago, everyone thought I was nuts. Then the second book, which was around this, they're all about the same topic. Second book, 6 years later, 7 years later, there was a team of about 80 people I'd met globally online that were, but equally in the 90s, the kind of the cypherpunk movement, there's a group of people who were kind of talking in certain ways. I met Doc Searls, who created this concept called vendor relationship management, where basically the public turns around to the companies of the world and goes, this is what we class as good enough for us and stuff. And we all kind of, so there I like finding the tribe and being part of something that people are seeming to resonate with. And you're right, I think there is a movement. There are paddle makers in every corner, and I'm hoping that we can gradually find each other more and more and more, and then keep in touch, because we need paddle makers unite, is what I say. Good. David, thank you so much for coming on, and I hope to get you on again in the future, and we should check in again and talk about where things have got to for both of us, for sure. Thanks for coming, man.
Jonathan. Good.
Cheers.